Well done. Thank you so much for that. As part of being the church, we gather to be prepared to hear God's word, and we finish up our little series on Thessalonians this morning. And in our reading, Paul gives us a little bit more to consider, and he writes that if the Thessalonians are really serious about living a life worthy of the gospel, then they are to aspire to live quietly, to mind their own affairs, to work with their hands, and to behave properly toward outsiders. Now, I am convinced that Paul raises these four actions for a purpose. Living quietly, minding your own affairs, working with your hands, and behaving properly must have had some significance for the beloved community and their faithfulness. So I just want to spend some time to work our way through each one to see if there's anything we can hear and apply as we strive for faithfulness. So he first says to live quietly. And what does it mean to live quietly? And quiet here doesn't mean to be silent as much as you would like for me to be. It doesn't mean that we are disconnected. Rather, living quietly means be calm and attentive. It's a positioning of oneself to listen. Literally, it means not running about here and there. And as the Greek implies, it means not to engage in the chaos and confusion that life brings. To live quietly means you are not to get caught up or entangled in the forces or pressures that overwhelm. See, I could argue that Paul's wisdom is for people of faith not to become overreactive, but rather thoughtful in their response. Paul says, be calm and responsive. I read in a response mode, you meet challenges without them becoming stressors. Events occur, even hard ones, but they don't have to rattle you. You deal with threats and loss and rejection without getting carried along by the feelings of fear or frustration or heartbreak. You're still engaged and sometimes handling very difficult things, but on the basis of an underlying sense of calmness, responsiveness, feeling as if you are cared for. To live quietly seems like some good advice that Paul offers us, particularly in these times of such confusion and chaos and distress. Now, next he says, mind your own affairs. Now, for some, this is going to be difficult. The ones who smile and knows who I'm talking about. But mind your own affairs doesn't mean become isolated and detached. In the Greek, mind your own means to be occupied with, to accomplish, or to practice what is going on in your life. And it's in the present tense. And that means it's something that we should do every day, incorporate it daily into our lives. The Thessalonians were to have the habit attending to their own responsibilities. And Paul is warning them against meddling or interfering in the affairs of others. To interest oneself in what is going on is not your concern, it's meddling. An act of interfering or intruding defines the action of being a busybody. Paul says, mind your own affairs, which prevents disrespectful and unauthorizing prying into the affairs of others. We all know what it's like when someone's meddling in our stuff. And in football, actually a really horrible football weekend, interference is a serious penalty because it prevents the action from occurring. Someone once said you would be very surprised of how much positive change you could have and make in your life if you could make it a top priority to mind your own business. So the third bit of wisdom is to work with your hands. And so no doubt Paul used it for a particular reason. He was referring to manual labor, and it would seem highly likely then that many of the folks in Thessalonica were working class laborers. We remember when we talked a little bit about what about the city and where it was located. It had a great harbor. It was located on a major north-south trade line. It was a great city, bustling with trade. It had natural resources, which included timber and grain and fruit and gold and silver. Laborers were a necessity. So interestingly, I found out that the Jews of that day upheld the dignity of all forms of labor and regarded work as mandatory for every Jewish boy, even those in wealthy families. They were taught a trade. Jewish rabbis also worked as a trade to learn a livelihood. Remember, Jesus was trained and worked as to work with your hands means to engage in an activity, and all activities involve effort. So work with your hands means make an effort, because effort is the opposite of inactivity and idleness. So first, let me say something about this phrase for those of us who are not yet retired. Work with your hands takes effort. And for those who are still working, how is your effort with your job responsibilities? Are you prioritizing your responsibilities effectively? Because work has value. What we do matters. It's more than making money. It's about being able to live your mission. And so Paul says for us who are working with our hands, make an effort to keep on doing what God desires of you. All right, so what does it mean for those of you who are retired? Work with your hands. I just found it to be an interesting question. What does it mean to work with your hands when you're retired? So let me reword the phrase. What if work with your hands can be translated as don't become lazy and indifferent? Now, there's not talking to many of you in here, but what if it just means don't become lazy and indifferent? Because we know that indifference is not healthy. Harvard Medical School states that throughout one's life, learning is essential. So work with your hands when you're retired means challenge your brain. Activate processes that will help and maintain and stimulate your brain cells. And whatever age you are, you can have a hobby, you can learn a new skill, you can join a book group, you can play chess or bridge, you can write your life story, you can take a class. Paul says don't get lazy, because when you're lazy and indifferent, you miss out on the goodness of life. Because inactivity is not healthy, nor does it lead us toward a path of faithfulness. So now the final nugget of wisdom from Paul is to behave properly toward outsiders. And that literally means to walk around and conduct yourself with behaviors that will not get in the way of others. He says, don't become a stumbling block, because the result is that others cannot experience the transforming presence of the risen Christ, because our actions contradict that. They were to conduct themselves with decorum and decently and in fitting manner toward those who are outsiders. They are not only to have the obligation to love one another, but they are to love those others and be good testimonies to the world. Paul says to some other believers in another church to clothe yourself with a distinctive nature and character that show who you are and who you are becoming. And he says to clothe, as God's beloved ones, clothe yourself with compassion and kindness and humility, meekness and patience, and above all, put on love. And again, this phrase, behave properly toward outsiders, is in the present tense, which means it's to be a lifestyle choice. They are to live as people with purpose, not as stumbling blocks, but testimonies for others to notice Christ. So Paul desired for the beloved Thessalonians to simply thrive as a faith community, as they live out their faith in the risen Christ, as they intentionally choose to live quietly, thoughtfully responding to the daily encounters, as they mind their own business, as they attend to their responsibilities, as they work with their hands and experience the goodness that life offers, and as they behave properly to outsiders. They are living as people with purpose, being testimonies for others to notice Christ. And they succeeded because we're proof of their faithfulness. And in 500 years, can that be said the same for us? Because of our faithfulness, the generations and the generations and the generations will come and experience the presence of Christ, the love of God. So, friends, these words are not meant only for those first Christians in Thessalonica. They are Paul's words to us. Paul offers us in this reading an opportunity to deepen our faithfulness. So let's just be bold today or tomorrow, maybe even on Tuesday. Let's just be bold and choose to live each day more Christ-like, because we too have purpose. It is to be living testimonies for Christ.